Good morning. Good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Ken.
Morning, Ken.
Well, sir, how are you? It's time to start.
Yeah, it's good to be with you this morning. Thanks for coming. First thing I've been asked to do is, if you haven't responded about the potluck, let me know, because Bonnie's in the kitchen. You didn't respond, I believe. Are you coming?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Anybody else that did not? Yeah, I got you. Today the potluck is really, really an honor for Orville E. We're back for a while from Indonesia. And so that will happen at 1 o'clock right here. And so we only have one person that's coming that did not respond to that, I take it. So there's your answer, Abner. We got it covered. All right.
What's up?
We'll let her know.
Well, what number does she need?
So there's three coming then? So there's three coming?
I think she wanted a total number.
She needs a total
I
number.
need to know how many.
Yeah.
Yes.
She knows what I know to this point, and we've got one more coming. I emailed her.
Yeah, but she asked me this morning to get a number.
A number? I don't know the number. All I can tell you.
Come on, you're 10 to 4.
PC and county. But I think that she said no, I believe if anyone else, we're wasting too much time on this.
Plan for a lot.
Yeah. So anyway, I ran late this morning. I apologize. This is going to be a great lesson today. I was late because I was looking into all the soap opera that's going on this morning, Doug, with Herodias and the Peyton Place people. So with that said, Marge, anything that you need to tell me about or visitors? Or
Not in front of everybody. I'm sorry. No, I don't have any announcements.
Okay, but remember, the potluck's at 1 o'clock. We'll be here, and we look forward to visiting. By the way, Orville will be giving us a history on what he's been doing the last year, which I know will be very interesting. And well, that said, why don't we have a prayer? Father, we're grateful that we live in a country where we can come and talk about how we think about you, what we discover about you, and feel free to talk. It's a great thing when considering what's going on in the world today, around the world. And I would ask this morning that this class be blessed, that we walk out of here as a written letter from you to other people, that what they and other people say this morning will be on our hearts, and we can take it out of here as a script, a narrative, so that we can share it. We ask these things in your name.
Good morning, everybody. Good to be with you. And I do have two announcements, actually. One of them is that we're looking forward to being with you next week. And we'll be there in person. Lorraine and I will be there. We're looking forward to that. And the other one is that today I am teaching another Sabbath school class, and we'll probably need to end a little bit early and will not be able to stick around and visit because of teaching this other class. But we'll make up for that by being there in person next week. So those are my two announcements before we jump into our lesson for today. Question. Can you think of a time when somebody was very generous with you? Can you think of a time when somebody was very generous with you? Now, before I invite you to tell that brief experience, let me see if I can limit this just a little bit more. How about a time when somebody was very generous with you and it didn't involve money or things? Their generosity came in another way besides money or things. Now, if I made it too hard for you and you need to go back to the first thing that came to your mind that did involve money and things, that's okay. But I wanted you to at least challenge yourself to think of generosity beyond money and things. Don't. Who has something that came to their mind? A time when somebody was generous with you.
I do.
Please.
Yes, when my mother died about 20 years ago, I was sitting at my house and I had a lot of doubt. And I thought I wasn't a good daughter. I was focusing on mistakes, and an elderly lady in my church called right when I was crying. And she said, I woke up from my nap today and I was feeling bad because I didn't get a sympathy card out to you and I'm not well enough to come visit you, but I just wanted to tell you what a wonderful daughter you were. So then I was crying.
Wow.
So I got my car, I drove to her house and I knelt by her chair and I just praised God that she was my missionary.
Yes. Thank you. That is generosity. Generosity to reach out to somebody else with a word of affirmation and kindness. Yes. Thank you. Somebody else. A time when somebody was generous with you. Please.
Somebody was very helpful in helping me obtain a job that I needed very much. I was a single mother and the temporary job that I had was ending and I didn't have another source of income. So they helped me a great deal by pulling a few strings and getting me a job.
Yeah, going out of their way to make sure that you had what you needed. Thank you. Beautiful. One or two others. Anybody else with the story of somebody who was generous with you?
Douglas,
Yes, Mother.
a few years ago, I broke my shoulder and had to have a shoulder replacement. But anyway, after the surgery and I was recovering, I needed physical therapy every week. Of course, I couldn't drive and my husband was busy working all day. So my neighbor very generously gave me of her time and took me to my physical therapy appointments every week. And that was so much appreciated because she was busy too, but she did that just because we were friends and she wanted to help me. Yeah.
That's a beautiful story, Mother. Thank you. So generosity of giving of time day after day, week after week, that was a bit of a process. Did I miss one more? If I didn't miss anybody, I'm going to move forward. So let me come back to the idea. Oh, one more, please.
Anybody who was around the tornadoes last year could probably relate. We had a lot of people helping clean up. And specifically, one guy offered about 2 hours with a bobcat to help clean up, asking nothing in return.
Yes. Yeah. Generosity with time, and in this case, coming out with this bobcat and using his skills, his tools to be helpful to others. There's a way of being generous that there's a number of ways, but there's one way that is especially important to me that we don't often think of, and that is generous with our attitude. Have you ever been around somebody who is always thinking the worst of other people? You don't have to raise your hand, but we probably have all experienced people like that, right? They're always jumping to the worst conclusion. They're always drawing a conclusion that is not generous toward other people. By contrast, think about being around people who are not just dumb or naive, but they have a way of seeing the best in other people and sometimes bringing out the best in other people because of their generous spirit. Instead of having a tight, self-absorbed spirit, they have a generous spirit that wants to see the best in other people and bring out the best in other people. And that is something that over the last few years, especially, I've come to notice, to admire, and want in my own life, and want to have a generous spirit like that toward other people. And it's that kind of generosity that we're going to be looking at in the story today of Jesus and John the Baptist. And you might remember that when we sent out the letter, the lesson, the title of the lesson is Two Generous Men. And if you look at it on the surface, these two generous men, Jesus and John the Baptist, really didn't have a lot of possessions. Both of them were relatively poor. And yet they were incredibly generous in a variety of ways. But the way in particular that I want us to see is the way that they were generous with their attitudes, generous with their abilities to not be small and self-absorbed and pulled into oneself, but to open oneself to others. And it's that we're going to look at. Now, what you mentioned, Ken, about the soap opera that goes on in this story, probably we won't take a lot of time with, and I apologize for that. As always, these stories are so full, so rich. There's so much we can look at. And we might notice it in passing because the soap opera here certainly is a contrast to the generous spirit of Jesus and John the Baptist. And so we might note it in passing, but really we're going to focus on Jesus and John the Baptist and the generous spirit that they both exhibit, and especially toward one another. Now, you may not have had a chance to look the lesson over and to see the train of thought that we're following here. That's okay. It may just unfold as we go, but I want you to know that this is where we're heading with this lesson, and we're going to read the passage with that in mind, and then come back and look at it in more detail. And so open your Bibles to, well, this is one of those cases where the harmony is really going to help you. Do we have extra harmonies for anybody who came without one?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So if you do not have a copy of the harmony, please raise your hand. Oh, I see a hand there, and we'll get one to you. And if you don't have a harmony and you just want to follow in your Bible, it's largely from the book of John, and that's where we're going to draw most of our material. But there is a section from the synoptics from Matthew, Mark, and Luke that is also part of the story. And so you'll want that too. So open your Bibles to John chapter 3, or your harmonies to page 37, which is article number 34. And we're going to be reading article number 34, which is a test of loyalty. That all comes from John 3. And then we're going to read about John the Baptist's imprisonment, which comes from the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then we're going to finish up with article number 36, which again comes from largely John, but Matthew and Mark have comments. So we'll be moving around among the Gospels, and the harmony will help you to follow that. So let's start here with John chapter 3 and verse 22 on page 37. After this, and the after this is referring to the Nicodemus story. What we're looking at is the things that took place shortly after the Nicodemus story that Ken led us in so nicely last week. After this, Jesus and his disciples went out into the Judean countryside, where he spent some time with them and baptized. Now John was baptizing at Aenon near Salem because there was plenty of water and people were constantly coming to be baptized. This was before John was put in prison. An argument developed between some of John's disciples and a certain Jew over the matter of ceremonial washing. They came to John and said, "Rabbi, that man who was with you on the other side of the Jordan, the one you testified about, well, he's baptizing and everyone is going to him." To this, John replied, "A man can only receive what is given him from heaven. You yourselves can testify that I said, I'm not the Christ, but am sent ahead of him. The bride belongs to the bridegroom. The friend who attends the bridegroom waits and listens for him and is full of joy when he hears the bridegroom's voice. That joy is mine, and it is now complete. He must become greater. I must become less. The one who comes from above is above all. The one who comes from the earth belongs to the earth and speaks as one from the earth. The one who comes from heaven is above all. He testifies to what he has seen and heard, but no one accepts his testimony. The man who has accepted it has certified that God is truthful. For the one whom God has sent speaks the words of God, for God gives the Spirit without limit. The Father loves the Son and has placed everything in his hands. Whoever believes in the Son has eternal life, but whoever rejects the Son will not see life, for God's wrath remains on him. Now, as I read this next part that comes from the synoptics, I'm going to follow the bold print down the page, and you might remember the way that that works is the bold print gives the specific details that are not repeated in the other accounts. And so just follow me as I read the bold print across the page, starting in Luke. But when John rebuked Herod the Tetrarch because of Herodias, his brother's wife, and all the other evil things he had done, Herod added this to all. He had given orders to have John arrested, and he had him bound and put in prison. He did this because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, whom he had married. For John had been saying to Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." Herod wanted to kill John, but he was afraid of the people because they considered him a prophet. Herodias nursed a grudge against John and wanted to kill him, but she was not able to, because Herod feared John and protected him, knowing him to be a righteous and holy man. When Herod heard John, he was greatly puzzled, yet he liked to listen to him. After John had been put in prison, and Jesus heard that John had been put in prison, the Pharisees heard that Jesus was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John, although in fact it was not Jesus who was baptizing, but his disciples. When the Lord learned of this, he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now Jesus himself had pointed out that a prophet has no honor in his own country. Now, a lot has happened here in this story, so let me just summarize quickly in case your mind wandered as I was reading there. We have some fighting between the disciples of Jesus and the disciples of John. And we have the disciples of John getting jealous of Jesus' popularity and coming to John the Baptist and complaining. And John the Baptist says, wait a minute, this is the way things are supposed to go. He needs to increase and I need to decrease. And then we have the story of John being imprisoned because speaking out against the wicked things that Herod is doing, foremost of which is taking his sister-in-law as his wife. And then it ends with the story of Jesus leaving the southern part of the region and going north and not staying where there is contention going on about the popularity of Jesus versus John. And John's in prison and he's not going to just stay there and rub it in, this fight that had been going on earlier, and he leaves for Galilee. So that's kind of the summary of the arc of this story. Now, go back and glance over what we read there, those couple pages that we read. And here's my question. Let's start first with John. What evidences of generosity do you see on John's part? What are the evidences that you see of John's generosity? Yeah, Ken.
Well, obviously that the ego thing is not in John's way at all. He doesn't mind losing popularity at all.
Yeah.
Doesn't need to be in the paper every day.
Right, right. That's a very generous spirit. He doesn't have to be in the paper every day. He doesn't have to have the spotlight on him. And when his followers, his disciples come to him and complain about it, instead of saying, yeah, that's right. What are we going to do about this? He says, wait a minute. You've got it all backwards. And he gives them a new perspective. So yeah, that's an evidence of John's generous spirit. Other things that you see here. Other evidences of John's generosity.
Douglas, this is Marlene.
Yes, Marlene.
He calls himself as the friend of the bridegroom. he is the groom, okay? He's coming for his bride, his church. I'm just the facilitator.
Yeah, and if you think of even our modern customs with weddings today, I was at a wedding not long ago, and center stage at the wedding is always the bride, right? That's who should have center stage. Now, in Jewish culture, it was actually a little bit shifted. It was the bridegroom. That was probably a little bit more because of the male-dominated society. But at any rate, either the bride or the bridegroom are really the center stage. They're the star of that day. And the friends are there to be supportive. And even the parents and the grandparents, they all get a place of honor, but they don't have the place of honor. And John is saying, you know, I'm the best man. Why would you expect me to be in the spotlight? The real star of the show is someone else. Yeah. Good. That's another nice piece of evidence. Any other evidence you see here? Gordon?
Well, I can think of the fact that the way he addressed Herod as a generous thing.
Yeah.
He didn't worry about himself.
Yeah.
In fact, I almost wonder if he didn't do that, knowing that that would take him out of the picture. And so he really would be less than.
Wow. I had never thought about that before, Gordon. That's an interesting thought. Thank you. Yeah. Sometimes our generosity may actually cause us to not only have a lesser position, but might actually cost us. Yeah.
I think Gordon deserves a +1 for that.
He does. Yeah, he'll get a +1 for that. Thanks, Abner. Let's see. I think I may have gotten a comment here on, no, not yet. Okay. Okay. So anybody else? Evidences of John the Baptist's generosity here. Anybody online? Evidences that you see in the story. And I think that they are primarily in John 3, verses 22 through 30. You might find other places, but take a look at especially that part of the story again, verses 22 through 30. Anything else you see there? Yes, please, Gordon. Well, you're using your free question here very quickly.
Well, you know, I'm thinking about him when he's talking to his followers.
Yeah.
Okay. He didn't get upset with them.
Yeah.
He didn't do anything to put them down. Actually seems like he was trying to help them move towards Christ.
Yeah.
And that was a generous thing to do.
Yeah, it was. It really was. Anybody else?
Me.
Anybody else?
Front row, hang on.
Yes, Keith.
Oh, Tiffany.
Oh, okay. I saw Keith online. Let's take Tiffany first, then we'll do Keith online. Please, Tiffany.
Oh, Keith. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so I can't help but notice there's a word that I had trouble getting over whenever I read this. And the verbiage says, and people were constantly coming to be baptized. When we use that word verbally, as we describe or interact, it's almost a word of annoyance, constantly coming. So to me, that painted a different picture of John the Baptist sacrificing more of himself than what was being painted by saying,
yes,
or constantly approaching him and coming to him. So selflessly, he was guiding people to Christ, even though they were seeking John for that information too, by explaining constantly what else was he giving up that this story doesn't talk about, just with the vocabulary words. And when you look at different texts or different versions of the Bible, the King James versus the New International versus the Study, the verbiage and the vocabulary word is consistent with that word constantly. It's not always the same word. And I only have about 4 versions of Bibles in my house that we looked at, but that constantly word was significant whenever we went over it.
Whoa. Thank you, Tiffany. Thank you. That is a beautiful one. And I don't know if this is partly in your mind, but if I'm not mistaken, you still have a young daughter at home. And I think of parenting, and if our kids are constantly coming to us when we are busy with something else, it takes a generosity of spirit to respond to their constant coming at times. Yeah. Keith, let's have your comment.
I just wanted to back up and strengthen what Gordon said. This is not just something happening, but the joy is mine.
Yeah.
Full of joy. I mean, this is really what makes me happy.
Yeah.
So it's not just putting up with it, but it's sheer joy.
Yes. Oh, Keith, thank you. That I was hoping somebody would pick that one up. That it's not just, okay, you know, a generous spirit is not a begrudging spirit. A generous spirit is one that really takes joy in giving. And I'm just so glad that is part of this story. Wonderful. Anybody else? Did I miss any other comments?
Yes, Doug.
Yes.
I've been wanting to be quiet. I feel like Gordon. It's verse 30. He must become greater. I must become less.
Yeah. He must become greater. I must become less. What a generous spirit. Oh, we have a hand in the back, John, and then I think we have another one up front. Please.
Okay, here's what hits me. A man can only receive what is given him from heaven. And then verse 31, the one who comes from above is above all. The one who is from the earth belongs to the earth. John is referring to himself as being from the earth, and Jesus as being from heaven. I have an idea that if I were John and I could hear and see the things that Jesus was saying and doing, I would be awestruck, and I would be happy to be empty and for him to be full.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Thank you, John. And I think we had a comment up front, and then I have a comment that's come in on text. Another comment up front? Yes.
I'm going to try to put this as succinctly as I can because there's a lot going on in my brain. But I've been reading the book, Misreading the Scriptures with Western Eyes. And he makes the challenge to you to, every time you're reading a passage, go, what went without saying? Culture that maybe the piece of the story that we keep brushing over because we don't think it's that significant. And I zeroed in verse 25 that the argument is developing over ceremonial washing. We know that incredibly popular and like very, very popular. He was like a superstar of the time. You know, lots of people were listening to him. And Jesus starts baptizing. And the Jews didn't have a problem. I mean, ceremonial cleansing was a normal thing. And the root of this is all because they're seeing this other guy baptizing. This whole situation is because there's a conflict going on over ceremonial cleansing. And I think that's significant. Like John is, you know, saying, hey, this is not the big deal. It's not what, you know, anybody can do it. It's okay, which is kind of contrary to the way they process the whole topic.
Yep. Excellent. And let me just add to that, Caitlin, that you have, keep reading in verse 26. They came to John and they said, Rabbi, that man who was on the other side of the Jordan, when you testified, well, he's baptizing. So you have, and then the statement, and everyone's going to him. So you've got the religious authorities complaining about John's baptizing because it doesn't fit in with what they think is right. And then you have Jesus starting to baptize, and John's disciples are complaining to him, and everybody's complaining about everybody else. And John kind of steps outside of it and says, no, wait a minute. Let's get the big picture again here. This is not about who's got it precisely the form of the ritual. He said, the big thing is that I've come to introduce you to the Messiah, and the Messiah is here. Let's keep that focus straight.
Well, you almost
and Ken, if I was to go back to, I'm sorry, go ahead.
You almost feel like you get the idea that the Jewish leaders who maybe have not been so hot on John are now kind of like, they're like, well, we know you, we can put up with you, but so that something new doesn't start.
Yep, yep. And if I was to go back to Ken's comments from last week, you know, with the discussion of Nicodemus, Jesus kept trying to point Nicodemus to something bigger than just the petty things that we can sometimes complain about, get stuck on. And John is definitely do that. His generosity, his generous spirit is pulling back to the big picture and say, wait a minute, this whole thing is much bigger than just this little point or that little point. It's about the Messiah. And the Messiah is here. Let's not forget that. Let's not miss that big point. And in the same way, I think there's an opportunity for us to say, when we are talking about our faith, when we're talking about religion, when we're talking about what matters to us, let's not miss the big point. Jesus is right there at the center. Let's not miss that. John, we're going to take your comment, and then I'm going to read what I got online, and I think we'll move forward. Please, John.
I think John is saying the one that knows most about it should be the one in charge.
Yeah, well put. Well put.
Douglas?
Oh, hang on just a second, Mother. Let me read this comment that came in here first. Not only does John acquiesce to Jesus' position, he also showcases Jesus' divinity, shifting the focus from popularity to Jesus and shifting the focus from the popularity to Jesus' mission and godness. Wow, that's well put. Yes, Mother.
It's interesting to me that the disciples of John can't even say Jesus' name. They just say that man.
That guy, yeah.
Yeah, it's sort of, they're just trying to dismiss him as a nobody.
Yeah.
And put him down. And, you know, that guy that you've been talking about. And John just turns it right around and tells them really exactly who Jesus is, building him up. And that I hadn't really caught that from the story before, but they didn't even think enough of Jesus to call him by name.
Yeah.
And
Isn't that something? That's a
John just sets him straight right away of who he
actually good observation.
really is.
Well, before we move any farther, especially because I have to quit a little bit earlier today, I want to make sure that we have time for this to sink in with application. Excuse me. As you look at John's behavior here, and we're going to look at Jesus in just a moment, his behavior, but as you look at John's behavior and the way that he acts, what is this stirring up in your own life? Are there situations in your own life right now where you realize you could have a more generous spirit, where you could be more generous with the people around you? Maybe the people who are constantly coming to you, or maybe the people who don't think the same way as you do, or maybe people who are getting the spotlight that you think you deserve, or people who are in some way challenging your ability to be generous. And Gordon, your hand went up right away, please.
I see two different ways of that generosity playing out.
Yep.
One way is when, in a sense, you feel superior to the person you're helping. And what you're doing, if I put a negative spin to it, you're getting a positive feedback to your own ego.
Yeah.
The other way is if you can be generous to someone who is superior to you. That's hard.
Yeah. Because it seems like sometimes the people who are above us, whether they are our employer people or church leaders or people that we assume have more power than us, we feel like we don't have to be generous to them. We can take shots at them. We can take all the shots at them we want because they're in a position that puts them up above and they need to be shot at.
Well, they also, you feel in some way that they're better than you.
Yep, yeah. And so why should I be generous to them?
Why should I? And also, would I look foolish if I do that? I mean, there's all.
Yeah. Yeah, good thought. Anybody else? What practical application is coming into your own life as you look at John and you
Douglas,
admire him? You say, I would like to experience more. Yes, please, Marlene.
what I think also the disciples of John, I don't think they were thinking so much about John as they were thinking about themselves. As John loses popularity, I'm going to lose my job. Okay, I'm going to be less popular. Yeah. So to me, the practical application is to look at the bigger picture, not to look at myself, to look at somebody else's needs rather than mine.
Wow. Wow. Sometimes we really fool ourselves, don't we? We think we are defending somebody else and we're really defending ourselves. Yes, please.
I think John was trying to get them to think too, because he says, hey, I'm not the Christ. I've testified of that before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Did I miss anybody's hand? You know, one application for me is this whole idea of giving other people the benefit of the doubt, cutting them some slack. And I realize that there are times when people need to be held accountable. I get that. And yet, even when we're holding people accountable, say somebody who works for us or our children, there's a difference between doing that with a mean spirit or a revengeful spirit or a putting them down spirit. There's a difference between that and doing it with a generous spirit. And having a generous spirit, even as you have to make a correction or make a tough decision. And I've been asking God recently to really do something different in me, that when I see something that I don't like, that my first thought is not to diminish that person in my eyes, but instead to say, I wonder if there's something I'm not getting here. And if I was in their shoes, would I see it differently than I see it from my perspective? And really to begin to have more of a generous spirit, that instead of immediately becoming critical, harsh toward another person, to say, that's something that's really puzzling to me. I don't get it. And to have more of a question than an attack. And that doesn't come easy for me, but it's something that God has been working on in my own heart and calling me to have a more generous spirit with the people around me. Anybody else? We're going to move on here in just a moment. John?
I'm reminded of when I used to run track. Sometimes we'd run relays and we would pass the baton to the new fresh runner.
Mm-hmm.
There comes a time in everybody's life when it's time to pass that baton to someone else who's fresh and strong.
Yep. And that's exactly what John is doing here. Yes. Okay, now here's what we're going to do. We're going to, did I miss a hand? Please.
I was just thinking, I think one has to be been on the humble side to be that generous. When John was speaking all these words, and all he was doing was basically sharing the gospel. Yep. And that just really strikes the heart of people, and they get awestruck. And when you are humble and you realize it has nothing to do with you, that it's all from blessings from God, you don't want the glory, you don't want the credit for anything, because you're too humble to get that pompous about yourself. And it's easier to focus on the real issue of how awesome the Messiah is than to think there's something marvelous about yourself that you have to start getting all ego-centered.
Yep. I love it. I'm going to use that as our bridge to go into the next part of the story. And here's the suggestion I'm going to make to you. That we could use a lot of words to describe God. One of the most familiar is we say God is love. And we've heard that often enough that sometimes it loses its impact. And we say, yeah, God is love. Yeah, I've heard that. Let me suggest that another way we could express that heart of God is that God is generous. and generous in all the ways that we've just been describing. And that if we were to flip that around then and say, what's the opposite of God? It is the inability to be generous. The inability to step outside of oneself and to see things from another's perspective, or to let loose the chains of self-absorption. The opposite of God is a spirit of harsh, critical, finger-pointing. That's the opposite of God. The opposite of God is the opposite of generosity, and we might try to put some other words to that. And I'd like to suggest that as we follow the arc of this story, we start off with John's generosity, we end with Jesus' generosity, but in the middle, we have the story of Herod and Herodias' non-generosity. And so let's take a minute to look at that, and then let's close on Jesus' generosity. So let's take a look at this middle part of the story of the non-generosity of these evil people. We have John as a godly man, and we have Jesus as God at the beginning and end of the story. In the middle, we have Herod and Herodias, who are not generous. And let's look at the non-generosity of them. So I'll read this again, starting with Luke, going into Mark and Matthew. And I acknowledge that this is not part of the flow of story in John. John doesn't tell this part of the story, but it is something that's happening in this time period. So Luke 3, but when John rebuked Herod the Tetrarch because of Herodias, his brother's wife, and all the other evil things he had done, Herod added this to them all. He had given orders to have John arrested, and he had him bound and put in prison. He did this because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, whom he had married. For John had been saying to Herod, it's not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. Herod wanted to kill John, but he was afraid of the people because they considered him a prophet. So Herodias nursed a grudge against John and wanted to kill him, but she was not able to, because Herod feared John and protected him, knowing him to be a righteous and holy man. When Herod heard John, he was greatly puzzled, yet he liked to listen to him. Now, I'm going to make a suggestion here. We've had a number of people speak up, but we've also had a number of people who have not spoken up. So what I'm going to invite on this next round of comments is to give first shot to people who have not spoken up yet. And those who have spoken up will get a chance in a moment. But let me give first shot to those who have not spoken up. And I know there are some people who never speak up, and that's fine. We're not going to pry you out of your seat with a crowbar. But some of you are willing to speak up, but it's just that others beat you to it. So let me give a chance to those who have not spoken up yet. Where do you see in this story of Herod and Herodias evidences of non-generosity? Let me hear from some of you who have not spoken up yet. Please.
In the first Luke, it says that he's holding all these other evil things. He's adding them up. He's holding grudges.
Yeah.
And adding that to his list of why John needed to stop.
Yeah, holding grudges is pretty non-generous, isn't it? Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Somebody else who has not spoken up yet. Please, yes.
Where's Philip? Is he dead? Where is he?
No, he's still very much alive. Yeah, sad to say.
So John's got Philip.
So this is why Ken referred to this earlier, that we really do have a soap opera going on here. Yeah. Yeah.
He took it.
Yeah. Anybody else? The non-generosity, and I don't know if you wanted to do a follow-up comment on that, but if we're looking at the non-generosity of Herod and Philip, hang on just one second. Herod is certainly not being very generous, nor is Herodias to Philip. Philip is kind of getting yeah, please.
Okay, so, it says that Herod wanted to kill John, but he didn't because he was afraid. So really, him not killing John was out of fear of the people.
Not generosity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes, yeah, things may look generous and they're really not. It's just plain old fear. Okay. Please, Marge.
But at the same time, it says he liked to listen to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the poor Herod, I feel sorry for him because he's pulled by this wife.
Yeah.
And he's just got all of this pulling against him. And I feel sorry for him.
Yep. And in fact, I hadn't thought about this before, Marge, but what you are bringing to mind is that this is kind of like what we're going to see in Pilate later.
Yeah.
Pilate is really torn about Jesus. He's pulled one way, he's pulled another way. And again, if I could just tie this back to our theme of generosity, when we are so in turmoil, when things are all tense and tight and pulled every direction inside of us, it's hard to be generous. And we're more likely to act out of fear than generosity. Yep. I'm only going to take a moment longer on this, but I want to catch anybody else's comment who's not spoken, and then we'll give a chance to people who have spoken. Anybody else who has not spoken about the non-generosity of Herod and Herodias here?
Got one online.
Okay. Yes.
It
was,
oh,
it's Beth, please.
Yeah. It was built by being corrected. They were told they're doing something wrong, and that kind of builds this sense of lack of generosity. It's the deep rootedness of why we feel like we do. We don't like to be corrected.
Yeah. A generous spirit under correction would say, oh, wow, I need to do something different here. But a non-generous spirit says, don't you tell me what to do. Yeah. I apologize. I missed a comment that came in on the text, and it's actually back a little ways, but it still fits here. Obviously, Satan was working to bring about division, and this would be referring back to the earlier part of the story. It works with humans really well. So Satan hopes it will disrupt and discredit Jesus' efforts from the beginning. And even though that's earlier in the story, it still fits here with what Satan is doing to stir up this non-generous spirit among John's disciples. And sad to say, John's disciples are acting about as non-generous as Herod and Herodias are acting. Kind of sad to realize that. Okay, let's come to people who have made comments before. I think there were a couple of people who wanted to make comments on this and were not allowed to in the first run because we were just picking up new folks. John.
Go back to the first of the lesson. The title is A Test of Loyalty.
Yep, yep.
So it says, Herod was greatly puzzled. Why? Well, the test of loyalty is who will be loyal to the principles of heaven. Jesus and John both demonstrated their loyalty to the principles of heaven. And why was Herod so puzzled? Because he had never practiced those principles before. He couldn't understand them.
Yes. Excellent. Excellent. Which goes back to what Jesus and John had both said in John 3. It says that somebody who lives in the darkness really cannot understand the light. And Herod was living in quite a bit of darkness, and he could not understand the light. Yeah, wouldn't allow it to shine in. Okay, folks, we've only got a few minutes left. I want to now look at Jesus. So we've looked at John and his generosity, and we've looked at Herod and Herodias and their non-generosity. And we've also picked up a little bit of that from John's disciples. They're acting fairly non-generous. Now let's look at Jesus. And this is just such a brief mention, blink and you miss it. So let's take a look at it and not miss it. And it's seen particularly from John 4, and it's over here, top of page 130, or top of page 39. The Pharisees heard that Jesus was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John. Now just land on that for a second. We know that there is a lot of conflict going on around who's getting more popular. We've already read that. And John the Baptist's disciples get hot under the collar. And they say, hey, wait a minute, what does this guy think he's doing? He's stealing all of our followers. He's pulling popularity away from you, John. And they get upset about it. But here we have this mention that there's another group who really doesn't like John, and they don't really like Jesus either. But notice what happens. The Pharisees heard that Jesus was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John. And then there's this parenthetical statement, although in fact it was not Jesus who was baptized, but it was not Jesus who baptized, but his disciples. So that's parenthetical. And then come back to verse 3. When the Lord learned of this, now stop and think of what Jesus learns of. He learns that the Pharisees are getting on the bandwagon that John the Baptist's disciples have been on. Who does Jesus think he is? He's stealing popularity from John the Baptist. That's what's going on. And Jesus learns that the Pharisees are getting on that bandwagon. When Jesus learned of this, he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. He goes back north, home. And notice what he's heading into. Verse 44 says, now Jesus himself had pointed out that a prophet has no honor in his own country. He's going back home where he knows he is going to be less popular. This whole story is centering around popularity. John the Baptist's disciples are jealous for John's popularity. Jesus is becoming more popular. The Pharisees are learning that Jesus is becoming more popular. And when Jesus realizes that, he heads north to where he knows he's going to be less popular. Now, as it turns out, he starts off less popular, but as you're going to see as the weeks go by, he actually grows in popularity once he gets there. But that's another story that's coming yet. But this story centers around popularity, and think about how easy it is. And I don't know why, but for some reason, the story of 6th grade comes to my mind. I don't know what your 6th grade was like, or 5th grade or 7th grade, but right around there in that age where popularity is so important. And some of us never quite outgrow that. And we can become very ungenerous when somebody is popular and we wish that we were that popular. When somebody is getting the attention, the raise, the promotion that we think we should be getting. When somebody is getting something that we really want instead, we can be very ungenerous. When somebody is getting the affirmation, we can be incredibly ungenerous. And here Jesus acts in a way in the face of popularity that has a very different feel to it than the way we act. And I want us to land on that and say, what evidence do you see here? How is Jesus acting with great generosity? Gordon, and then let's hear some other comments.
This is my number 4. I understand that.
Yeah, I know. We've been keeping track. But if we're generous, we may give you 5 today.
Yes.
When I think John is trying to become less, and he may be doing this Herod thing on purpose for that reason. If Jesus stuck around, it would have really complicated things. Jesus moves away and allows John to be executed. That's one way to look at it.
Mm-hmm. Now, again, remember the time frame here. John is going to be in prison for at least a year before he's executed. But nonetheless, he is going into prison that is going to result in eventual execution. Yeah, good point. Somebody else, what generosity do you see on Jesus' part here? Did I say hand here? Yes, please.
I think it's very telling that John and Jesus are the only 2 people that aren't focused on the popularity, and it took a lot of godliness to step away from it and realize it become more popular at the time probably would distract from the Heavenly Father's message. And so to draw that take down the chin to really let the message itself be the focal point and not his popularity.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, thank you. I think I've got another comment here online. Hang on just a second. Adam and Eve imbibed the poison of self-centeredness from Satan, which now infects all of us from then until now. Each of the groups mentioned demonstrated this attribute of Satan, though in different ways. God works continually to rescue us from the destruction of self-focus. This has been one of God's missions for us. Yeah, yeah. Well put. What do you see in Jesus? Let's take a moment to admire Jesus here. How is Jesus? Incidentally, all of this is happening pretty quickly, and my guess is that Jesus is moving north about the time that John is being arrested, but we don't know precisely. I mean, what we have, remember the way the story started here in John 3, verse 24. This was before John was put in prison. And so we know that the story begins before John is put in prison. And then by the time the story is done, John is in prison. But when did all this movement take place? We probably don't know exactly how it happens, but it's all happening pretty quickly and pretty close together. And Jesus moves north, possibly just before John is put in prison, maybe after, maybe about the same time. But it does not, and here's the important part, John does not tie Jesus moving north to the imprisonment. He ties it to the popularity issue and the Pharisees jumping on that popularity bandwagon. So focus on that. And what is that telling us about Jesus and Jesus' generosity? Gordon?
Well, this may not be true, but it seems to me that Jesus was taking his disciples with him, and avoiding a disciple-to-disciple confrontation.
Yeah, yeah,
good. He was trying to tamp his people down. That didn't mean they weren't going to have issues.
Excellent. He is separating these warring factions. He says, okay, guys, let's just kind of cool our jets and we'll get out of this area for a while. He's not going to keep these two warring factions together, John's disciples and his disciples. Excellent. Please, Tiffany.
So this is the same King Herod that 30 years ago ordered the death of all the men.
Different guy, same family, but different guy.
Different.
Yeah, that guy has died in the meantime.
So my question, why is it so significant that it says, okay, so in this, and I looked at this a little deeper and never got to the bottom of it, but it says that when Herod heard John, he was greatly puzzled. So something that's noted is that there were many things that were done in earlier manuscripts. Like, what does that mean? What is the significance between Herod and John and Jesus, where they all tie together that Herod was greatly puzzled, and yet he's the death of John the Baptist forthcoming, you know?
Good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer for you. I'll give you a couple thoughts, and I'm open to other people's thoughts on this, and that is, I think that what's the tying together here really is power, and that Herod is really wanting power and wanting to hold on to power. And that's part of what this is not just a sexual scandal. It is that too, but this whole thing with Herodias has to do with consolidating power too. And so if you look at what Herod is doing to try to keep power and what John and Jesus are doing with different types of power, and the fact that in some way all of them are contending for the same spot of loyalty of people. Herod from the standpoint of saying, I do not want an insurrection on my hands. I don't want the power from the people to flow towards somebody else. And Jesus and John handling the way that power is coming in. There's a power piece here. And Tiffany, I'm not sure that answers your question completely, but if you look at both the historical setting and what says in scripture, I think there's a lot about power going on. which could be tied to popularity too. But I think that's the idea that ties it together.
He's afraid, he was afraid of them. I think it's just funny that he puts John to death, but not Jesus, he doesn't.
Yeah.
Hands on him, but just that whole part of the story is very stimulating in my curiosity. This is what it is. And so I know that doesn't tie into the generosity, but that's definitely, I'm the ruler. I want the power. John and Jesus, people just flocking to them going, you're our saviors,
Yeah, excellent. Caitlin, and then we'll take a couple more comments and I'm going to wrap us up here. Caitlin?
So connecting to what she was saying, I went down a rabbit hole.
Okay.
Not unusual. Because it says that John rebuked Herod the Tetrarch for Herod, his brother's wife, and the other evil things.
Yep.
It doesn't say in scripture, but the people at the time that read this would have known.
Yep.
So, I started reading on him, and of course, he was a Herod. He was crazy. But Herod, interestingly enough, he's co-ruler with Philip, the brother that he stole his wife from. Philip was not careful to coddle the Jews. So when he minted his coins, he stamped his face on it. Herod knew, because his two older brothers had to die in order for him to even end up king, that his rule was tentative. So when he minted his coins, he didn't put his face on it. He was trying to placate the Jews and say, hey, I'm the good guy. Look at Philip, the crazy one, the graven images. I'm the good one. So when John is calling him out on his sins that go very much against Jewish tradition, he's afraid of losing power and revolt because he's the one that's been so careful to balance it out so he doesn't rock the boat. And John's like, hey, look, he's crazy too.
Oh, excellent. Thank you for that history. It's been a while since I've reviewed that, so thank you. I'm really glad that you brought that up. Folks, we need to wrap up. Did I miss a hand? I'm going to wrap this up here in just a moment. Okay, let's come back and just look again at what John says here in John chapter 4. The Pharisees heard that Jesus was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John, although in fact it was not Jesus who baptized, but his disciples. Could I say that one of the things right there, Jesus didn't have to be the one doing the actual baptizing. I think there's good reason for that, but he says, you guys do it. You take care of it. And Jesus, so far as we know, never baptized a single person. He did not need that spot. He said, no, you guys do it. We even see Jesus' generosity, I think, in that act. He says, no, you guys do the baptizing, and I'll kind of watch here. And then it says, when the Lord learned of this, that is the Pharisees hearing that Jesus was gaining more disciples. When the Lord learned of this, he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now Jesus himself had pointed out that a prophet has no honor in his own country. One of the things I admire about Jesus is his incredible generous spirit. And like somebody said earlier on, it really takes a level of humility to be generous. And Jesus is showing a generosity, a humility, an unflappable calm in the middle of all of this stuff that is swirling around him, and to move forward doing what is best for everyone, best for the mission that he's about, best for John the Baptist, best for John's disciples, best for the Pharisees, best for his disciples. He says, let's do what's best for everybody here. And I think that just kind of lowering the pressure for a while, turning the heat down. Gordon, I'm sorry, I won't be able to take your question. I'm going to wrap up, but I'll have to catch it from you later. And saying, let's turn the heat down here. Let's just kind of lower the temperature, and let's make sure that we keep focused on what's really important. You know, that spirit of generosity, wisdom, calmness is something that I want very much in my own life. And I say many times to my students, and I think I've said it to you, that even if Jesus were not my Savior, even if he was just this historical character that did a bunch of stuff, and he's far more than that, I would admire him for the way he handled tough situations. Jesus was so wise here in saying, let's just kind of ramp this thing down. Now, there will be times in his life when he will ramp things up, but not here. This is the time to kind of ramp things down and to let everybody cool off and give them a chance to do something better, to be their better selves. And in that, Jesus is incredibly generous because he could have seized this moment and whipped things up to pull more attention to himself, and it would have actually just harmed everybody. And Jesus' generosity here is to say, let's kind of turn the heat down. I'm going to take off. I'm going to leave this situation, and I'm going to go a place where everybody can just kind of settle down and give this some thought. And we're going to have to end it for there. And I think that the thing that I want you to come away with today is to say, how am I allowing God to create that kind of wisdom and generosity in me? Because it's one of those things that will make me more like Jesus. Ken, turn it back over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Again, Doug will be here next week, so I hope we'll be able to come and enjoy the lesson live and in color. And I know I will. Again, we have a potluck today at 1. If you didn't, I don't even know how many people are getting my emails. I'm surprised how few people have responded, not that you're under pressure. So I'm wondering if my emails are even getting to a lot of you. If you did not know about the potluck, come. Well, I'll run over to Taco Bell. I think most Adventists are familiar with Taco Bell. The real spring close to me, get that part. So that'll be enough. It'll be enough. So come if you didn't get it. And if you're not getting it, you come to me after we finish here. And let's start all over again. There's 250, 300 people on the email list now, Doug, I think.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
So I don't think some of you are even getting emails. So come to me if you have time. I'll be here, and let's get all that started. Again, come. We'll work it out. You can have my food. I would not hurt me in this meeting. So with that, Ron, would you have our prayer this morning? Thank you.
Dear Father in heaven, we thank you for the lessons of the day. Pray that we might take them to heart and practice. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you. If you're not getting an email, come see me. Thank you.